Hi everybody, welcome back to TQS. It's the fabric embellishing class and this is lesson 4. I'm Lauren Vlcek, and if you've completed all of your homework from last week, you've got all of your decorative grass stitching done in the heart flower block, you've got your ribbon couched on, your cording couched on, your rickrack couched on, all of your little extra applique pieces covering your raw edges, and you've done a little bit of quilting on a few blocks, and you've got it all bound. So by now your quilt should look just like this. Today's lesson is going to be hand stitching. I'm going to give you some tips on a few tools that are my favorites and give you just a few basic stitches that you can have great success with. We're only going to be doing 4 stitches, and you'll be amazed with the visual impact you can get from just a few simple hand stitches. All right, the first thing I want to tell you about is my tools. I'm going to be stitching with a size 24 chenille needle. It's my favorite needle to stitch with using the heavier decorative threads. Speaking of the heavier decorative threads, my 2 absolute favorites are Silken Pearl, and I've got it wrapped around the label, but the Silken Pearl has a nice sheen to it, nice twist. It's fabulous for some hand decorative stitching. And then a Valdani Pearl Cotton in a size 8, so it's a little bit larger. Working with these larger decorative hand stitching threads, I'm just going to give you a tip on this tool. This is an amazing tool. It's a Clover Needle Threader, available at SueSpargo.com. The thing that's really great about it is most needle threaders have just that wire that pulls through the eye of the needle, and this actually has a strip of metal. So it's a little bit wider, a little bit thicker than a normal needle threader, and you can pull these heavy decorative threads right into your needle. It makes it super easy to thread. All right, so the first stitch I'm going to show you, I'm going to be working up in the sky block, and I'm working with a little bit of the Silken Pearl. I cut off about a distance from my heart to the end of my hand. I call it a personal yard. If you're really tall and long-armed, you can handle a longer piece of thread. If you're short like I am, you have a shorter personal yard. I'm just going to cut off a bit of the thread, and then using my needle threader, I'm going to pull it into my size 24 chenille needle. Pulls through really nice and slick. Okay, now when I tie a knot on this thread, I'm going to want to be able to pull it into the body of the quilt sandwich. I don't want my knot to show on the back. I'm just doing my stitches, and my stitches aren't going all the way through the quilt with the exception of this one running stitch. So it's a little bit different than the rest, but I still want to pull my knot into the body of the quilt. So I'm going to lay my thread facing my palm a little, the end of the thread is facing towards my palm, and I'm going to make an X with the point of the needle and my thread on my finger and wrap it 2 or 3 times because this is pretty heavy thread, and then just slide that little twist all the way to the end, and that makes a nice little knot. Then I'm going to come in from the back of my sandwich to where I want my starting point to be. Let's see. I'm going to give a little bit of, carry a little bit of distance through the body of the quilt so I have area for the knot to land. And then I'm going to give it a little tug until I feel that knot pop into the body of the sandwich. Then when you do your running stitch, it's a lot easier to stitch in and out of the sandwich 2 or 3 times before you pull your thread through. You'll get a lot smoother stitch. It's similar to a hand quilting stitch, but it's just a lot chunkier, a lot folkier looking. And then you'll get this added decorative element up here in the sky. So I'm just sort of following the gentle curve of my zigzag that we did in lesson 2 to get a chunky running stitch. And I'm actually stitching all the way through the quilt sandwich, so it is doing a little bit of quilting as well. Okay, I'm just going to leave this tail hanging here and we'll move on to a stitch that's called the ricing stitch, or some people just call it a random single stitch. I'll be working down here in the leaf block, and again with silk and pearl, or actually let's use the Valdani pearl cotton. That'll show up a little bit better. I'll cut off my personal yard and thread it into my needle. It's just a lot easier to get these heavy decorative threads into the eye of your needle if you've got a little tool like this. It's so easy to thread. Okay, same way I'm going to tie my knot. End of the thread towards my palm, make a little X with the needle, wrap around the needle 1, 2 times, and then slide it down to the end. Give it a little tug, and I've got a knot. Pulling it into the body of the sandwich. Okay, there we go. Give it a little tug. Now this time I'm not going to stitch all the way through the entire sandwich. I am just going to do random running stitches in all different directions. It's a single stitch, not really a running stitch. In all different directions. I'm going into the quilt. I can feel behind it with my finger so it's not going all the way through. And I'm taking about a scant 1/4 inch stitch. A scant 1/4 inch stitch. So I'm going into the quilt. I can feel it's not all the way through. Scant 1/4 inch and pulling out. And you'll just randomly do these little hatch marks until you've filled the leaf block. So it's similar to the running stitch, but it's just sort of one little piece at a time. Okay, I'm going to leave that one. And I'll do some French knots in our tulip here. Again, piece of thread, same knot. You'll really get used to this knot. I've heard it's called a quilter's knot, so maybe you all know that already. Okay, I'm just going to come in from one edge. Oh, coming in from the back. I want to put my hands so that you all can see what I'm doing. Okay. Give a little tug. And feel, you can feel it. Sometimes you can even hear a little pop when that knot pulls through into the sandwich. Okay, so French knot, you've got an illustration in your pattern if you can't perfectly see this, but what I do is I'm going to wrap my thread around my needle. And the more times you wrap around the needle, the bigger and chunkier and kind of looser your French knot will be. So I like to go, 3 or 4 times, and then I insert my needle back in exactly where I came out, and I'm going to slide my wraps down around to that point. I'm not going to pull them really tight, but I'm just going to make sure they're wrapped down there at the point, and then pull my needle through. Making a really nice French knot. Now I'm coming out the back of my quilt right here, so I'm just going to go right back in that hole where I was to tuck that thread up into the sandwich, and then come out the top, and that hides that little thread. I haven't made a stitch in the back. I've tucked it back up into the quilt sandwich. That'll keep your quilt a little bit more tidy in the back, and you can do a variety of French knots. Your pattern that you download this week will tell you everywhere on the quilt where I've done French knots, everywhere that I've done ricing, and everywhere I've done running stitch. Let's do one last really fun stitch that I love. It's called the Lazy Daisy. I think it's still a fairly simple stitch, but it just sure is fun to look at. So one last piece of thread I'm going to thread in here using my handy dandy tool. Same approach for all of your decorative stitches. You'll make your knot and pull it into the body of the quilt. And I'm going to come out where this bud meets the stem. That's where I'm going to start my Lazy Daisy stitch. So going into the sandwich. If I can wiggle it in there, okay. And then coming out. Let's see if you can see that. My thread is coming out right where the stem sort of meets the bud. Okay, now the trick to this is that I'm going to put my needle in next to, not in the exact same hole I just came out of, but fairly close next to it. And then I'm gonna go forward inside the sandwich the length I want my Lazy Daisy stitch to be. So I'm going back in where I've come out, and then this is how long my little loop's gonna be. So I'll wrap my, whoops, let's get this out of the way. This thread where it's coming out, I'm gonna loop it around my needle. Pull my needle through. And then the thread that, my working thread that I have in my hand right now is what's holding this loop in place. So I will just go back into the quilt, taking a little bit of a stitch. You can go back directly there and you won't get a little line, but if you take a little bit of a stitch, then you get this little line at the end of the Lazy Daisy. Then I would come back and do a couple more Lazy Daisies at the base of this bud. So those are the 4 stitches that we've learned in class today: running stitch, ricing stitch, French knot, and Lazy Daisy. They're scattered all over the quilt, so be sure and check your downloadable PDF pattern to make sure you hit all of the places where the decorative stitches belong. All right, we're gonna see you next time. Have fun with all of this handwork. And remember that I have the companion pack with smaller amounts of the thread, and you know, we have beads coming up, those kinds of things. So if you're interested in just getting enough to work on this little sampler, check out laurensfiberart.etsy.com and get yourself a companion pack. All right, we'll see you next week when we're doing bead embroidery.